come in when she finished.
Fantastic. Summit fundraising. And I've worked with charities for over 13 years in major gifts and major donor fundraising. And that's as a fundraiser, as a head of fundraising, as a director of fundraising, and I'm also a trustee now. And I've worked with over 100 nonprofits and charities. So I've seen the blocks to raising large gifts, and I've also seen what works and seen some really great successes. So particularly today, I want to focus on the last 4 months because it's been quite unique. If you can cast your mind back to February, which to me seems a bit of a lifetime ago, at the time I was working with about 10 to 12 different charities, different organisations, helping them set up their major donor programs or improve them, or coaching their fundraisers. And so I got quite an insight when all of a sudden coronavirus hit. I'm trying to move my slides, but as often is the case, there we go, there's a few technical hitches. So coronavirus hit, and if you want to remember back to March and April, you may not, it was a really chaotic time. Some of you will still be finding it really chaotic, but we went into lockdown quite quickly. And that had quite a lot of implications for major donor fundraising, for all fundraising. It had implications for everything. And I carried on working with these group of charities and with these group of fundraisers throughout. So back in March and April, this is what was happening. A lot more home working, a lot more stress, a lot of people working from home, a lot of people furloughed, a lot of charity managers spending a lot of time organising furloughing. And these are a lot of the quotes that I got. So a fundraiser whose major donor programme had focused on a lot of special events, saying, I've just had to cancel them all. It's been pretty terrible. Quite a few people just thinking, I can't contact my major donors. I don't know what to do, but it just doesn't feel right to do it. A lot of people so engrossed in all of the additional working from home, remote working, helping with services, changing them, just saying, I don't have the time to do fundraising. And quite a few people just saying, it just doesn't feel right asking people now. It is not the right time. So that's where we were a few months ago and where the charities I was working with were. Fast forward to the last month, 6 weeks, and I'm just incredibly proud of so many charities, but particularly the ones I've been working with, because this is some of the feedback that they've had when they have contacted donors, that, oh my gosh, I'm so surprised, said one fundraiser. They were actually really happy to hear from us and to hear from me. There's been really big gifts secured, so a 6-figure donation for one charity that does not have a big brand, people putting on engagement events online, and one charity in particular really doing a musical event and really seeing that connect with donors, a charity admitting and a head of fundraising admitting that it's forced them to ask for money because their financial situation has actually been so dire and so stressful. And she reflecting, saying, I'm not sure if we'd have made some of those asks if it hadn't been for coronavirus. Again, more gifts secured and a real openness and some really great conversations built. So there are things that these charities all had in common, and I'm going to take you through some of them. And there are some things with that you can be doing as well now. And I think the first thing is a little bit softer. It's not one practical things, but it was more a belief that they knew their organisation needed funds before coronavirus, and they knew that was the case afterwards. In fact, potentially even more so. So much has happened, so many budget cuts, services cut, services increased, income gaping holes, a lot of stress I think a lot of you have been under, and they just held on to that fact that actually they still needed money. Even if they weren't direct coronavirus response, they needed funds. Another truth that human connection is really important. And again, if you remember that kind of deep lockdown time where you couldn't see anyone apart from who was in your household, connections is what makes relationships and is why philanthropists give large gifts. And actually, what coronavirus showed is that connection is really important and that charities can play a real role in that connection. And really believing that people who'd given, who'd been associated with the charity, cared, and that actually they would still care after coronavirus. So that was kind of a more general thread running through it, is that belief that whilst everything seemed to have changed with coronavirus, some things didn't really change much at all. So what were these charities actually doing? First of all, they called. They got in contact with their major supporters. And if you don't have a major donor program already, some of them were just calling their key supporters who'd maybe not given largest gifts, but who'd supported a lot in the past, maybe patrons, maybe ambassadors. And they realized that that connection was vital. They put all of the worries to the back of their mind of, I'm not sure they're really going to want to hear from me. What if they've got coronavirus? What if their business is in turmoil? I just don't really want to speak. They won't want to speak to me. That is really common, and we can talk ourselves out of it. But what the charities that called found is generally donors were really happy to hear from them. So a regional health charity fundraiser phoned me up after a coaching session and said, oh my gosh, this donor was so pleased to hear from me. And she was genuinely shocked. The donor was really intrigued to see how the charity had been coping, and she was made to feel really special. So these were calls, not with an agenda, not to ask for money, to check in and to say, this is all a bit crazy. This global pandemic is incredibly tough. How are you? And what was happening from those conversations is building more relationship and finding out a lot about that person. People were volunteering information. So the CEO of a charity found that actually one of their major donors in a construction sector was really struggling with their businesses. I mean, that's fantastic to know, because then when you're thinking about making an ask, you're going to be aware of that. And so you're just not going to make one to that person for a period of time. So they were finding out information. And what's also been happening is that the people who've been making those calls to donors have been feeling really energized. So a fundraiser at a wildlife charity said after a day of calls that she felt amazing, because actually they were getting that connection as well and having a focus to keep their major donor program going. And that is something that can still be relevant now. This might be frustrating if you've been furloughed or if you haven't had the staff, but we'll come on to next steps. But it is still relevant, and it's still possible to call your donors with no agenda and to say, my gosh, the last 4 months, wow, how have you been? How are things going for you? And the great thing about these conversations is that it's almost impossible when you ask someone how they're doing for them not to ask back, so how are things for you? How are things for the charity? And then you can spend some time telling them about where you're at and having some really honest conversations. And that links to my next point, which was that they still thought, the charities raising large gifts over the last few months, still thought of that next step. So what do I mean by that next step? For those who've been working in major donor fundraising, I might be teaching you to suck eggs a bit. You may be aware of this, I'm sure, but we build relationships and deeper relationships, building trust and seeing people face to face. We haven't been able to do that. And what we're always trying to plan with our major donors is, what's that next step? What's that way of engaging them? So for example, if they come to an event in the old world, when we could see people at events, what's the step after that? And what are they interested in and how do we engage them? And on those calls, they were keeping in mind that next step. So for a donor who said, actually, my investments aren't doing so well right now, the fundraiser who went, that sounds really difficult. I completely understand you can't give. Would you like to catch up again in the autumn so I can tell you a little bit more about how the charity's gone and we can catch up? Donor, yeah, that would be great. Okay, she's got that next step for the autumn. Dementia charity I've been working with secured a meeting with a venture capitalist that it had taken them over 2 years to try and get. It was on off. This venture capitalist had given, but at a lower amount. He could have given a 6-figure gift. And they'd really been trying to secure a meeting with him. And they got one within 2 weeks of lockdown. Remember, everybody's lives were so different. People had, in some ways, more time because these people weren't traveling all over the world. They weren't having the same amount of engagements. And visits were being planned as well, and virtual visits. And that's a really interesting thing that charities have been doing that I'll come on to. So they were thinking of that next step and making sure they still had that momentum. At its very simplest, it was just coffee. Oh, you know, you mentioned you're really interested in this kind of homelessness service and what we're doing with it. Would you like to have a coffee with me and the head of that service next week? And we can have a chat about it, obviously virtually, not face to face. So that has given them real momentum, and it's given them the opportunity to carry on that relationship, even if that person cannot give right now. And it's given them the opportunity to share some of those stories. So there have been some incredibly, just incredible stories of how you, in your charities, have kept services going and what has been happening. And I spoke to a fundraiser. I was coaching her from a learning disability charity. And she said to me a few weeks into lockdown, oh, it has been particularly hectic. And I thought she meant kind of her homeschooling situation and working from home. And she said, we've been through a load of new training. And I said, well, what kind of training have you been doing? And she said, we have been trained to help the care leaders in the residential homes where we're caring for people with a learning disability in case there aren't enough staff because of coronavirus. So a fundraiser being upskilled, this small charity, to make sure that at all lengths and at all costs, they could still provide the care. I'm just closing my window. I hope you can't hear it. For those of you who know me a bit better, you'll know I have chickens and they are squawking quite a lot. So I alluded to this. What is the third thing that these charities are doing to get larger gifts? They were running online events and not just stopping. So, of course, that one-on-one engagement, that one-on-one Zoom coffee has been great. But A-View, even now, and A-View as of a couple of months ago, we'll kind of wait for this to blow over, and if we had any special events planned, or if we had, you know, a dinner planned at a trustee's home, we'll just kind of postpone it. And obviously now we don't know how long social distancing is going to be on. So what they haven't just done is shuffled events back. They've put online ones on and really thought about what the donors might want. And some of them have been really small and simple. So a hospice I've been working with put a webinar meet, a bit like this, but with far fewer people. With I think they had 5 donors attend, and they had some really intimate conversations with the CEO and their lead consultant at the hospice, because hospices have been doing incredible things during the coronavirus, supporting the NHS, and they told the stories. And yes, it was 5 people, but it was 5 people more and 5 donors more than would have been engaged otherwise. The NSPCC has been running a pandemic busting power hour. I love the name of that. From really quite early on in lockdown, so that key supporters, not just major donors, corporates and other supporters, key supporters, could actually dial in and hear, how is Childline working? What's happening? What's happening to the children? Are they okay? How are they still being supported? So those are just a couple of the examples. Oh, I also mentioned the music charity. So a really small music charity in the north of England, I mentioned at the beginning, who just really got the point that it might not be just about raising money now, even though they were desperate and they really needed funds, but actually what their donors shared was a love of music. And that's why they gave. And they don't have a very large major donor program. So a lot of these donors that engaged would have been under £1,000 with maybe the potential to give more. And they had an evening of music, a really small intimate group, about 10 of them. And they also had the opportunity to chat in a group afterwards. And the fundraiser there, when he spoke to me, said there was this kind of amazing connection because they'd all been missing live music. And that's what they really shared. And that was one of their real kind of losses of the pandemic and how passionate they were about it. And he said the follow-up, when he followed up, the feedback he got was fantastic. So he has then got those relationships to build on. And the fourth thing that a lot of the charities have been doing is they have been asking, and that might seem a little bit at odds with what I was saying, which is just cool to check in with people. That's what they've been doing. Don't go and just make an ask. But a lot of charities, I don't know any cause that doesn't need funds and doesn't need them relatively quickly, if not now, within the next 6 months. And what they've understood is that there is joy in giving. Professor Jen Shang does a huge amount of work on philanthropic psychology and that connection that people can have with an organisation and how good they feel. And what the charities that have been securing funds have done is they've realised this and they've had confidence in it. There is research from Blue Frog, an agency, who are interviewing philanthropists every few weeks, and I think the last one's up as of a month ago, about their attitudes to giving. And they've been saying, I'm at home, I've got a lovely garden, I feel guilty, I want to give, but it's weird, I'm not really getting asked much at all. So they really put themselves in their donors' shoes and they asked when it was appropriate. You're not going to ask the construction businessman who I mentioned earlier within a few minutes of the call had said, oh gosh, it's really tough, I don't know what's happening with my businesses right now, or the woman who said my investments have crashed, I'm not in a position to give. You're not going to ask them, but they have asked for funds and they've used the stories and they've used the need of where their charity is at. So a CEO I've worked with secured £200,000 in 5 days. He set up a series of meetings and made 6 asks. He'd never asked a major donor for funds before. And that has not only just given the money, much needed money, for a part of their work that they're restarting, it's just enabled him to sleep that little bit better at night. A fundraiser 4 months into their role touched in with donors, did an online event and secured the largest gift the charity had ever received, £250,000. And the dementia charity I mentioned, I'd been working with a fundraiser there, secured a 6-figure gift. It was 10% of someone's salary. And that person wanted to do something so much that he said, I'm going to pledge 10% of my salary this year. I see the impact on people with dementia. I want to make a difference. And I'm going to try and persuade some of my colleagues to do the same. So those are the 4 things that a lot of the charities who've really had success in this area have been doing. I did say I'd touch on the future as well. So I will give a view. None of us have fundraised through a global pandemic, and I think that was the really interesting thing when this started, is we didn't know. Nobody knows what to do. We're all kind of, to a certain extent, making things up as we go. I think it was Wayne Murray, who does a lot of strategy work, who basically said, you take the strategy and you rip it off. But I think there are some trends I've spotted for the medium term and the short term that could help you. For me, the charities who really make their existing donors feel special will be the ones that raise more and that keep their donors. This is donors of any level, but particularly major donors, because that's what we're focused on today. You can't thank enough. There is research from Professor Jen Shang and Adrian Sargent that if you thank your donors 4 or more times a year, they will give more. They give more and they give for longer. It sounds so obvious. We always talk about retention or looking after people, but this is more than just a nice thank you letter when someone's given. This is people who've given before coronavirus going back to them and saying, because of your gift back in February or because of your gifts last year, this is what we've been able to achieve. We've been able to ride the storm. This is what we're doing now for people, for the environment, for animals, whatever your cause is. It's really thoughtful touches, and it's actually having more of a thanking program, because so many of us are focused on getting the money in. We write a nice handwritten thank you card to the donor and that's done. No, it's not. How can you make your donors feel amazing from a gift that they've given consistently, either through those engagement things we talked about, through coffees, through meetups, without agenda, without necessarily just asking for that next gift? And that's going to be more important, I think, than ever. I've talked about online events, but these online events have been amazing. I've been to so many and worked on so many special and high value events. And I know somebody said that was specifically their role. Oh my gosh, are they hard work? You're sending the invitations 16 weeks out. You've got a capacity for 75, but you've only had 40 people accept. So you're thinking, oh my gosh, is the room going to feel really empty? Who do I invite? Stress, stress, stress. They're expensive often, or you're having to find a host to actually front the cost. I think there will be more online events for major donors. Again, if you're putting yourselves in philanthropist shoes, in the normal world pre-COVID, they got invited to, oh my gosh, tens if not hundreds of events every month or every year. Special events, black tie events, charity carol concerts, this and that. The feedback from donors is they've been happy to join online. And actually that saved them travel. And one particular major donor I interviewed was saying how they loved the online event because actually they couldn't normally make it down to London for the charities events. And they got to go because it was online. So I think a lot more of that. It's low risk. I mentioned the hospice that had a really small number of donors on their event. That's fine. So I think that will be a trend going forward and could really help. And it can help smaller charities as well. And I think the third thing is keeping the momentum in this area. Of course, I would say that I love this area of fundraising. I think it's fascinating. And I think the psychology of why and how we can inspire people to give large gifts is fascinating. But aside from that, your causes need money. And although we cannot compare the pandemic directly to the financial crash, in 2008, major donor income to charities held up and quite a few donors gave more. We know there are holes with social distancing in a lot of different types of other fundraising. So major donor can really play a role. If you're not speaking to some of these individuals who already know your cause, they know other charities. You are not their only charity. Other charities will be, and other charities will be engaging them. And a lot of you will know that, return on investment for a major donor program can be as much as 9 to 1 for an established program, but maybe in the first year or two, 2 to 1. And giving is elastic. Dr. Beth Breeze, who is the director of the Philanthropy Centre at Kent, some of you will know she's interviewed hundreds of major donors. And what she's found is that major donors often don't have necessarily that fixed budget whereby they're only giving £100,000 a year. The key reason major donors give is because they're asked. Maybe they're introduced to a new cause they didn't know about, or they go along to an event. And in that sense, giving in this area is elastic and more elastic than regular giving and individual giving at a lower level, which means there is potential. And so when as a sector, we've got a 450 billion gap, which was, I think, the early estimates, and the government have just given £750,000 worth of help, it is wise to be thinking about how you can move this area forward and keep momentum. I understand that's really tough, but this can be done at any scale, whether it's a smaller charity and as a CEO you think, actually, I have to spend a bit of time on this now, or whether it's trying to persuade the board that actually they shouldn't be furloughing or making a specific role in this area redundant. Because these large gifts that I spoke about aren't just to the top 20 charities, to the universities, to the Great Ormond Streets of this world, because sometimes we think that major donor gifts are. They're given to a whole range of organisations, and if you can build some of those relationships up and inspire people to give, they will give larger gifts. So I've obviously talked a lot about the last 4 months, but so much of it is relevant to now. If you're going back into a role and you've been furloughed, or if you're starting out now, you haven't kind of missed anything if you haven't been doing some of this already. Practically, what can you do? You can make some calls. You can make them today if you're in your role. Make 5 calls. Get on the phone. Don't let those voices of now's not a good time. I don't know if they'll want to hear from me. Maybe they're busy again because lockdown's lifted a bit. Just make the calls to your key supporters and contacts. If you don't have any way of phoning them, email them to try and get a coffee Zoom meeting. And check in how they are and just listen to them. Secondly, find 2 stories relevant to your organisation now, and by now I mean in a post-COVID world. So the story that fundraiser told from the learning disability charity was the odds that they were going to make sure that everybody that they were supporting with a learning disability gets that support consistently by her being trained and having a whole plan in place. Find the stories that show how much your organisation needed and what a difference you're still making, and tell those stories. Schedule your online event. It takes so much less planning than a physical one. Sometimes we can feel uncomfortable with it because I think the irony there was I just froze. I hope that hasn't been happening throughout, but I was just saying that if you have an online event, there is nervousness because things can just freeze. But honestly, it's so much less work and investment than a physical event, finding a venue. You can have a similar setup. You can have some speeches. You can have some people telling the stories about the amazing work you do. And you can keep it really simple, but definitely try and schedule one in. And lastly, do fight for major donor fundraising. I was speaking to a head at a charity the other day who just didn't agree with the decision that was being made or proposed to be made about not investing in this area. And she put a case together because she thinks there's potential there, and there likely is potential there with some of their higher value donors. So that's it. That's me. Oh, this is a really snazzy thing. I've got loads of resources on my website, and I send out a free kind of fortnightly tips and hints email with bits on it, so to help you raise more large gifts. If you would like to get the free hints and tips email, you can get your mobile phone. This is about as technological as I get. And you can hold it up and open your camera. And when you open your camera and hold it up to the QR code, it should have a little note saying, do you want to open this web page? Yeah, if you want to get more free tips, they're on there. And I've also realized that a lot of charities don't have big budgets. So historically, I've worked with some charities quite in depth or on one-to-one coaching. And I realized that that just isn't possible for all charities. So I'm launching some online video training this month as well, which takes you through in a bit more detail some of the key elements and some of the key techniques and approaches to raise more large gifts that you can kind of do in your own time and at your own pace. And that's me. It's kind of over to questions now.
Brilliant. Thank you, Louise, so much for that. We've had quite a few questions, actually. We'll start with those. And if anyone's got anything else, then keep adding them to the chat, and we'll try our best to keep up with them. Right, so the first one, more of a comment really, was from Kevin, who said that working through the crash, 2008-9 crash, has lots of similarities to the present time. So I don't know if you've got any kind of comments from that at all.
No, it's just really good to get your thoughts, Kevin, and to get other people's experiences. Because I agree, on the one hand, you think, well, this is what happened with major donor giving then, and there was a shock. And certainly I think with major donors, it was a similar experience of maybe not knowing what their sector was doing, and if they had investments or if their companies are in certain areas. So no, it's just good to hear, Kevin. Thank you for the comment.
So the next one's from Marie. She's asking if you've got any tips for asking for funds to cover core costs, so salaries, versus funds towards your direct work.
Yeah, great question. And one of the trends has been more unrestricted funding. There are some trusts, not all, and funders who have gone to charities and said, spend this money where you need it most. So I wouldn't necessarily think of it as salaries versus project costs. I would think of it as about your organisation. And I think often we assume somebody wants to restrict their money before we've really established that. So all of the gifts I spoke about were actually unrestricted. It was just that CEO, that fundraiser, that head talking about the need overall to a major donor, how important it was. And so, you know, rather than giving, you know, £10,000 for a specialist bit of equipment, they've been giving to the organisation as a whole. And actually, you know, a lot of high net worth individuals and major donors are in business worlds, or they've made their money through business. They're really highly connected. They will understand that your operations are not easy to run right now. So yes, they might want a loose restriction if you're a larger charity for their money to go on research or certain services. But for a lot of organisations, you can inspire them to give to you as a whole. And they are not necessarily coming back and saying, actually, I don't want to fund those salaries, or actually, I don't want to fund this, because they understand it's really tough right now. So I think having those kind of open conversations, and if you're not sure, don't assume they want to restrict it, because I found out on a social media thread I started the other week that that's really common. And sometimes maybe they restricted their gift in the past, so we kind of restrict it for them. If they say, well, I'll give £20,000, we say, oh, we'll put it towards that project. You might not have to do that. I mean, how wonderful if that money could come centrally. And if it's a bigger gift, then even better. So I hope that helps and answers a little bit.
Brilliant. The other, somebody asked if you could pop the details of the philanthropic psychologist you mentioned, Jen.
Oh, yes. It's Dr. Jen Shang. Shang. I'm trying to find my chat box. Could you pop it in? Is that all right, Claire?
Yeah.
I have used Zoom before, I promise. I've just got too many screens open. And I've just done an amazing 8-week course with her in philanthropic psychology, and it's really transformational. So if you have the chance, she does shorter courses as well to learn from her. If you're interested in raising more, but just also generally interested in this area, and it's not just for major donor fundraising, it's the whole span, I would highly, highly recommend it. She's brilliant.
Yeah, I've seen a few people that have done the course, so good to hear that it is really, really good. The next one is from Georgia, and she said that they've actually been asked in their organisation to keep virtual events post-lockdown.
Fantastic to hear. Thanks so much for the feedback, Georgia. So presumably from some of your donors?
Yeah, so what she's put, what she's put is that the donors are really liking being able to log in and actually asking, if they can continue the events so that they can increase their attendance moving forward.
That's really exciting. And Georgia, I don't know if you're in a position to unmute or if you want to, but it would be great to understand how that's been for you as well. So obviously donors are preferring it, because I found a lot of charities are finding them kind of less time, shorter timescales, less cost. What's your experience?
Yeah, so it's been really exciting for us. I'm actually on furlough at the moment, but before I went on furlough, we moved our lab tours online. So we have discussions with our researchers, and it actually opened up who we could ask. So we've got researchers up in Glasgow or across in Wales, and normally all of our events are London-centric. But moving them online meant that we could hear from different panelists, we could invite major donors from across the country. And actually, they've all said moving forward, it's so much less time consuming for them. And if we could keep like a hybrid of real events and virtual events, they would be able to give more of their time, which of course then would lead on to more donations, which is fantastic.
That's great, Georgia. What's your organisation?
It's Blood Cancer UK.
Fantastic. Well done. That's really good to hear.
Yeah, really, really good. Exciting. I like the idea of going around and seeing it. Yeah, I suppose if you get to see it in real life and then virtually, there's probably things you notice that you don't when you're there and things like that as well. So
and there's been some really innovative stuff like that. Air ambulance charity down in Cornwall, they had a new helicopter that they just raised enough money for, and their plan post-COVID before it came along was to have a tour and to have a big reception, and you could see the helicopter in the hangar, and they obviously couldn't do that, so they did that online as well and did a virtual tour of the helicopter. So it can be really simple, and it can just be a webinar, but you can also do some really amazing things like George is doing in the labs, or like the air ambulance charity, to really, you know, connect people to what you're doing. It just takes a little bit of thinking to think, what's that for me? What's that for my cause?
Brilliant. Yeah, so George has also asked another question. She said, have you seen any really successful income generation online events with a major donor focus or predominantly stewardship focused?
Successful in the sense of just what's worked well, feel free to unmute. And as in from donor feedback or raising actual funds?
Sorry, me again. I think the question was along the lines of, have you seen any really successful income generating, as in, have you seen any black tie events go online? Or do you think it's more of the smaller ones with a stewardship aspect that have been more successful?
A really good question. I did hear of one from a major donor, actually, not from a charity, who said that it was for an arts organisation in London, that she had been really looking forward to an actual evening event, and she really enjoyed those black tie events, and they were asked and had an evening to dress up, so it was an equivalent of that evening event. So she said she put on a full kind of like ball gown, and she said that breakout rooms were used to create small networking groups, as would be if you were in a room at the black tie event. You'd kind of navigate, and you'd probably be in a group of 3, 4 or 5 people, and you'd have a chat. And certainly she said she'd really enjoyed that. But I think, as often, Georgia, and you'll know from your events, I think there's often a mix, and I don't know of any, this doesn't mean it hasn't happened, but the charities I've worked with, they haven't made an ask on it, but they've been pretty good at following up with that next step that I said, and then maybe making an ask one-on-one, which is not dissimilar to the real world of when, you know, a lot of events, as you'll know, Georgia, and you said, are used for that engagement. There might be some. If anybody knows of any, feel free to unmute and shout.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd say is I've really enjoyed people using their ambassadors more. So although that's perhaps, I mean, and you don't know if they're giving a gift anyway. So I think it was Stephen Fry who did it for that Alzheimer's research, I want to say it was. And they raised over 120,000 from an online quiz. So in one night. So I think it's probably asking people, not being afraid to ask, as you said as well.
That's a really good point, Claire. Remember, you know, our major donors aren't in a silo, and a lot of the other online events you're doing, they might be more general supporter focused, but they're potentially going to be coming along to them, like the quiz. So or maybe doing, you know, some different events as well that you're putting on. So it's a really good reminder, Claire.
Another question, this time from Nikki. She asks, what external research is there to put the case forward to invest in major donors?
Yeah, it was interesting. As I said, I was talking to a head about this the other way. I've got a blog on my website at summitfundraising.co.uk where, and on the blog section, I think it's called, Are You in a Post-Coronavirus Mindset? And it talks about some of the things I've just talked through about the ROI, about what happened in 2008. And obviously we've had Kevin add to that as well. There are a lot of similarities that Giving held up. And she just said she put quite a lot of that into a paper for her senior leadership team. So that might help. It's something I actually want to work on and put as a free resource on there, because I get asked it a lot, is something maybe a bit more a template that you could use, but I haven't got it yet. So some of those facts and figures are in that blog and might help. And it certainly helped the lady the other day who contacted me.
Perfect, thank you. The next one's from Nikki. She says, I coach non-fundraisers to fundraise. One in particular always has an excuse, feels uncomfortable and resists coaching questions. What have you tried that works?
Oh, fascinating question. What an interesting, interesting niche of coaching for non-fundraisers to be fundraising. What I have tried is kind of conversations about, I mean, there's a number of things. that can go quite deep. So it depends what your coaching relationship is. If some people aren't going to open up, but I think one of the things is about that joy of giving, and do you actually believe as an individual that giving is good for you? So I'll often talk to people about what's their reference for when they gave and it felt amazing. And it doesn't have to have been a big gift. It doesn't even have to have been a gift. It could be giving time, and when they felt connected. So that kind of grounds you and really starts that process of thinking, because what I hear, and I've heard it from a CEO, is that he's had £20,000 from somebody, but he doesn't feel good about it because he thinks that person is poorer for giving the £20,000. Obviously financially they're poorer, but they are actually so much richer. So my reference that I use a lot is that I'm a Beaver Scout leader with little ones 5 to 8. And I get a huge amount out of giving that time, and I give a lot of time, but I get to see the kids grow in confidence. I feel really connected to a whole movement of scouting. At the moment, I'm getting the parents say, oh, you know, this is little John's like highlight of his week because he doesn't have school. All of those things give me real joy in the giving of that time. And I think you sometimes have to reflect in on yourself to realise. And the link, I suppose, back is often we don't ask because we don't really believe that, because it just feels too uncomfortable. So that's the first thing, is finding that own reference point. And the second thing I would say is, if they're willing to learn more and will take some time, is to read Beth Breeze's book, Richer Lives. And that is interviews of hundreds of philanthropists. And it's from the horse's mouth saying, I think, there's couples saying, I think we get a lot more out of our giving than the charity does. Obviously they need the money, but it's brilliant for us. And I think we have to put ourselves in donors' shoes and people who've got a lot of wealth shoes. You know, a Chinese billionaire I saw speak a couple of years ago, and he talked about like all the trappings of wealth and how it's causing huge problems for his legacy, for his business and for his inheritance and planning it. So he's giving loads of it away. So I think we just need to try and put ourselves in other people's shoes. But really, if you're going to ask for money or at least move forward in this area, you've got to believe that giving is really good for people and that they can enjoy it. So good luck with it. It sounds like a tricky relationship, but that might help a little bit.
Our next question is from Ruth, and she says, do you have a link to your video course? But is that going to be perhaps in your newsletter, I'm guessing, when it launches?
It is on my website. So if you go to summitfundraising.co.uk, and on the top there's services, and it's also on the newsletter. And if you do want to get some, you know, the blogs and things emailed out on the newsletter, because that group are really lovely and are really engaged, I'm saying that anybody in that group, if they sign up to the video training, can get a free coaching session as well, because I love coaching and I think it can just help embed some of the training as well. So yeah, you can sign up or you can just look, and I'm going to be putting, if you follow me on social, I'm hoping it will go live tomorrow actually. So if you follow me on social, I'm at Summit Fundraising, and that's my LinkedIn. It'll be out this week and next week as well.
Amazing. Well, there aren't any other questions in the chat box at the moment. So if anybody has got any more questions, please do add them.
Yeah, or if anybody wants to share any experiences like Georgia did of what they found worked in their organisation or what they've been thinking, that's really helpful for others as well, I think. No?
No? Oh, hello.
I saw a flash.
Andy has just said, I wonder what your advice has been in terms of making the ask virtually. Is it different at all to in person?
Yeah, really good question, Andy. I mean, ideally, yes, in person, but no, just try and get camera, try and get face to face. So I know people that have called donors on the phone and they were asked to switch to FaceTime, saying, oh, you know, it would be lovely if they think their donor's used to it. So I think my primary thing would be, don't do it on the phone. But I think it's pretty close. It's pretty close when you can see somebody on camera, is my view. We've obviously all read about Zoom fatigue and how it does confuse our brain. But obviously what you get is over 50% of our cues when we're communicating are non-verbal. And you really don't want to make an ask without that. You really don't want to. So at least you're getting those cues on Zoom. So yeah, no, ask a lot of asks, and all the asks, actually, all the gifts I spoke about that had been secured had been made through either Zoom or, you know, FaceTime or whatever other video conference facilities are available, and have been successful. So I think it's more, as you'd probably be doing anyway, Andy, with an ask, making sure you've actually got that kind of one-on-one time or 2-to-1 time, and actually not necessarily getting someone on the hoof, but saying that you'd actually like to meet, which you do in real life anyway.
Brilliant. Well, we haven't had any other questions, just some thank yous for a really helpful session and helped focus thinking. So yeah, thank you very much, Louise, for coming and joining us this morning, and taking some time out to kind of get us all thinking about major donors, and what we can do really at this really challenging time to make sure that we're still connecting.
Thank you,
Brilliant.
everyone.
Yeah.
I hope you have a great day.
Everybody.
Nice to see you. Bye.